Welcome to my little podcast, The Resolution Room.
Damien, great to be here. Thanks for the invite.
We've got something in common more than the fact that we're practicing lawyers. We come from Toowoomba.
We do.
And we both went to the same school.
We do.
St Mary's CBC. You finished in 86 and I was in 88.
Correct.
And we had coffee last year and you described it as, how did you describe it, Simon, St Mary's?
I often get asked, Damien, ever since I moved to Brisbane 30 years ago, what school did you go to, which you never get asked in Toowoomba. And I would say I'm not from Brisbane. And they'd say, where are you from? And I'd say Toowoomba. And they go, Grammar or Downlands? And I'd say, no, a school called St Mary's. And they'd go, what's that? And I said, it's Christian Brothers School. And they'd say, what, like Nudgee or Terrace? And I go, nothing like that.
Nothing like.
I said, let me put it this way. If you get expelled from a state school, you went to St Mary's.
That's exactly right. And I had a very similar experience with people that I've spoken to in Brisbane when they said, Christian Brothers School. And you go, well, it was a pretty different place.
The other end of Edmund Rice's spectrum.
Yeah, that's exactly right. It was all inclusive, can we say? It was very much all inclusive.
It was.
But some good learnings there. And then you're, of course, now the MD of Shine Justice and Shine Lawyers and the Shine Group, effectively. And so I've followed your career as a fellow Toowoomba guy and a lawyer. Let's go back in time a bit to once you finished at St Mary's. You did do a stint with another firm in Warwick, but you were one of those 5-year articles and you were pretty much at what was the predecessor of Shine's in 1990, is thereabout?
87, I first started in the law, Damien.
And when did you end up in what was now Shine?
88, I joined Shine. So I did 5-year articles. I remember getting job offers at 3 law firms in Toowoomba and one from this little firm in Warwick. And the partner in the firm drove from Warwick to Toowoomba for the interview, which I was astonished by, and that sort of sold it for me. But after a year in Warwick, I discovered it was a bit tough being out there when you're studying and shoots in Toowoomba and football in Toowoomba. So moved back to Toowoomba and joined Shine.
Joined Shines, and you've been there ever since?
37 years, yeah.
37 years. And what a story it's been, huh?
Yeah, it was a small firm. When I joined it, we had about 10 staff.
I think you did my mum and dad's wills. It was a kind of a...
Possibly.
It was probably one of those firms, I could say, in Toowoomba setting. Toowoomba, quite as conservative at times, and Shines was always a little bit different. You had that sense, even as a kid looking on.
Yeah, the firm was started by Kerry Shine, who ironically came out of what's now Clayton Utes. So he did his articles at Clayton Utes and was a graduate lawyer and then set up his shingle in Toowoomba. So he was a bit anti-establishment. You know, as you know, Damien, there are firms that have been around for 100 years in Toowoomba. So Kerry was a bit of a new guy in town and had that slightly rebellious streak about him.
That's right. And he started the firm in the late 70s or thereabout?
April Fool's Day, 1976.
76, there you go. And when you started, give us a snapshot. It was what, about 8 to 10 people in
about
the
10 staff. Yeah. Conveyancing was most of the income. As an article clerk, you start off doing the mail and the banking and the court filing, and then you progress to dividing fence disputes and crash and bash cases, and ultimately landed in personal injury litigation.
That wouldn't have been a straight line. How did you end up in personal injury litigation?
We merged with another Toowoomba firm and became a large firm by Toowoomba standards. There were 7 partners and probably 30 or 40 staff, and we decided to specialise. So we had a commercial team, a family law team, criminal law team, and a litigation team, which only did personal injuries. So
right.
That's how I started in PI.
I see. And you pretty much went straight into the litigation group of that firm.
Yeah, there were 3 of us in the team. Steve Roach was the manager, if you like, and he was the partner. I was the trustee article clerk, and we had a paralegal. So it was a trio starting personal injury work.
Fast forward to what? I'm going to say the mid-90s, you become a partner at the predecessor firm?
Yeah, I became a salaried partner in 95 and then equity in 99 and moved to Brisbane in 96 to start the Brisbane office.
Right. Looking back, do you have a sense of how young you were to be a partner in a law firm, or was that just a given?
In our firm, it was a given. There were young partners. Today it's a different story.
Different story today,
as you well know, and you've got to earn your stripes for years and years and years. But one thing I admired about Kerry Shine and Steve Roach was they didn't care too much about tenure. If you were hungry and you were good, they'd back you.
And when you started in terms of personal injury, did you have any sense of where the firm was going to grow and become as it is today? Or was it more organic and just developed organically over time? Those early years must have been quite exciting, Simon, in terms of putting a shoulder to the wheel and building something that we see today.
Yeah, so we started in Toowoomba doing it, Damien, mainly workers' compensation cases, bit of motor accident. Didn't touch areas like medical negligence or public liability. We started acting for a couple of local unions. So we acted for the Meat Workers Union and the rail drivers, and that's how we got our start, I guess. And it wasn't till the move to Brisbane that we decided to hit the accelerator and really try and grow it. And in those days, there were no specialist personal injury firms. There were, and you may remember some of these firms, labour firms like the Goss Downey Carnes and those types.
That's right.
And you had two very big firms down in Victoria, in Slater and Gordon and Morris Blackburn, and they were really the leaders back in that day. Yeah,
it was a very different environment. The market was very dispersed, wasn't it?
It was very dispersed. Yeah.
And so when I look back, looking around the landscape, other firms were probably far better positioned from a market sense back then to do what you've done now with Shines. And the reason I mention that is it can be easy to look at it with a hindsight inevitability.
Yeah.
But there isn't a hindsight inevitability in terms of what you did.
Yeah, absolutely. When we first moved to Brisbane, there were some very established firms. So we were a newcomer into what we regarded as a very big Brisbane market. And the other thing is there was no such thing as national firms. So everyone stayed in their state. Yes. And there was a bit of an unwritten understanding, I think. And if I remember correctly, I think it was Slater and Gordon who were the first to breach that one.
That's right.
And move interstate.
Yeah. And so then, of course, to fast forward in terms of what you find yourself leading today, tell us about Shines now in terms of its the number of staff, its locations, etc., just to paint the picture of where you were from 10 staff to where you are now.
Yeah. So let's go back to when I started. There were about 10 staff. Turnover in revenue, maybe $1 million a year. Practice areas very disparate. Today, just under 1,000 people, $200 million turnover annually, and just practicing in 3 areas, being personal injury, class action, and now the international work that we're developing.
And you've always had a strong Queensland brand in terms of, I understand what the point you made, that when you first came to Brisbane, you were new kids on the block, but over time it took off quite well. I actually interviewed Dan Toombs, another Toowoomba boy. I don't know if you listened to that pod.
I didn't.
You should listen to it because he had some great conversations about doing a lot of your copy and your points of difference that you were quite unashamed about in a fairly conservative market back then. But anyway, I digress. So when was it that you decided after maturing the Queensland business that you also wanted to move interstate and in more recent times overseas?
The late 90s was the move interstate for us. And what started that, of course, was the Victorian firms coming into our backyard in Queensland. So Slater's first, Morris Blackburn followed them pretty quickly. And we thought, look, if we're going to compete, we better compete. So we made the decision to nationalise the business state by state. Victoria was the sort of first place we went to, New South Wales next, WA, and then around we went in the years to come.
Did you find, looking back at those times before we talk about the international story, that you came across very different cultural approaches that were quite stark as a Queensland practitioner going to other states?
Absolutely, and I think Victoria is the prime example. There's a methodology that Victorian litigators adopt, which is very different to how we litigate up in Queensland, and no amount of convincing on our part was going to change that methodology. So what we have come to learn over the years is there is a common thread to everything we do in every state. It's damages-based litigation, and the steps are broadly the same: initiating documents, pleadings, discovery, experts, ADR, trial. Then you've got to then deal with the nuances of each state, both from a procedural point of view and a statutory point of view, and as best you can get some commonality about how you run your litigation, but respecting those differences in the states. Yeah.
When our Queensland firm joined DWF as an international, we hit across some huge cultural differences in terms of the English and the Australian, and that whole secret of having enough uniformity to have a sense of consensus and where we're going, but also really respecting the individual peculiarities, if I can call it that, of each jurisdiction, getting that right as you grow is culturally quite tense at times and not easy.
It's enormous. One of the current directors on our board comes out of the McDonald's system, and he told me the story of McDonald's first start in Australia back in the 1970s, and you and I are old enough to remember this. Pickles were on McDonald's hamburgers back in the 70s, and we didn't know what pickles were in Australia. And I don't know about you, Damien, but I can distinctly recall you'd go to McDonald's and you'd pull the pickles off the burger and you'd throw it against the window. It was sort of a ritual. And this director explained to me that the cleaning costs for McDonald's Australia were through the roof because of
the pickle rebellion.
And they pleaded with head office in America to, can we please take the pickles off the burgers? And eventually the US relented. But fast forward to other generations now, and the pickles are alive and well back on the burgers.
That's a great story about the tension that you get. And professional services is very different because of the people nature of its business and the key people nature of the business that you've got to be really alive to as you build a business.
It's very territorial, and you've just got to find that balance between respecting the territory but trying to get consistency.
Sitting across the table from you, a thread that I see is obviously you started in personal injury, you've told the story, but you must really enjoy the business of law as well, obviously, and the growth and the challenges that brings. Have you got more joy out of that as the years have progressed?
I think I've come full circle, Damien. So I started as a litigator. As the business grew, shifted into management functions throughout the business, and that becomes your way of life when you're in that role. In the international work, I'm sort of nosing back into litigation again and loving it.
There you go. So you're back to where, and let's talk about that because we've talked about the Australian expansion and now talk about the international expansion and where your focus is in the business.
Yeah, we opened our first international office in New Zealand about a decade ago, and ostensibly we were acting for commercial property owners whose buildings went down in the Christchurch earthquake. So they were in disputation with insurers. So we did a lot of that legal work for them. So that was our first taste. And that sparked, I guess, the idea for Shine that, Australia's not a huge country. We've got 25 million people. We've got plenty of competition. Is it possible to litigate in other countries? That was the first idea we had. And it was probably 3 years ago, Damien, that I went to the board and said, look, there is a particular type of class action that Shine runs where the defendant is routinely a large US multinational. Product liability is a great example of this. You have one drug go bad, it affects everyone around the globe. So our thinking was, could we actually operate litigation in multiple countries against one tortfeasor in the United States? So that's how the idea was born. And the model is we've set up a hub in the United States. And the job of the hub is to identify cases that fit that profile and then litigate them in what we call spokes, which are the other countries we litigate in. And the thing we're learning is, particularly with the larger mass tort cases, the ultimate decision-making happens in the United States. It doesn't happen in the spoke countries. So having a presence where the decision-makers are, we thought was important.
To the point where you're spending quite a bit of time now on that project in terms of a US presence.
Yeah, the board generously allowed me time to develop it and set it up in addition to my duties as the managing director. I live these days between New York City and Brisbane, so I spent a reasonable amount of time in New York doing that work.
That's a great story, Simon. And from someone who's known you for a long time, I suppose you must think back as a kid in Toowoomba thinking, how did this happen? It must be quite remarkable to think about that story and its growth. I can't think of a player in the Queensland market that can tell a story like that, and we shouldn't lose sight of it. I want to go to another point in that story which sets Shine apart, which is its listing in 2013. Is that right?
2013.
So that's what, 12 years ago now? 12 years ago, quite a process. You weren't the first, were you? Was it?
No. Slater and Gordon were the first, I believe, in Australia to list back in 2007, and a couple of other smaller firms listed in the meantime. But yeah, we entered in 2013. Yeah.
What was your driver, Simon?
There were three considerations, I guess, for us, Damien, that led to the decision. The vast majority of the shareholding in the firm was myself and another lawyer. We had about 10 lawyers with a smaller holding. we wanted to grow the business, and we'd watched Slater & Gordon as a competitor using the capital markets to grow the business, and our only way to compete was using debt or cash. We wanted to consider a succession model, both for our equity in the business and for leadership coming forward. And the third one was probably more an altruistic one, and that is, as you know, the limitations in partnership structures are only the lawyers can share in the spoils, and we wanted a model where if anyone in the business wanted some skin in the game, a vehicle to do it. So they were probably the three main reasons we made the decision back then.
We have something in common as well as some areas in Toowoomba, and that is we both worked in listed law firms, which I find fascinating. Not many Brisbane lawyers could say that. So in our case, in March of 2019, DWF listed on the London Stock Exchange, and it was a perfect storm. It's no longer listed. It's been bought out by private equity. I think we had that conversation. And it was a perfect storm in terms of Brexit and some of the other factors at play, and it was best for it not to be on the market. I totally understood the view that the new owners took in terms of taking it off the market. But I want to talk to you about that in terms of the future of listed law firms in professional service. I voted for it. I thought it was an experiment worth having. I thought for the reasons you cited, it was something that was worth doing. You often come across the fundamental argument around conflicts and that it can't exist comfortably with your professional obligations. What do you say to that, Simon?
Two things I'd say to that. One is, and I don't know what the current rules are for firms that might be contemplating it, but back then we had to get the imprimatur of the legal regulator at the time, so we had to go through that process. But most importantly, when the prospectus was issued, it had to be set out front and centre to any potential shareholder of the company that the order of duties for the company, which is contrary to typical public companies, is that our first duty is to the court, our second duty is to the client, and our third duty is to the shareholder. And shareholders needed to understand that if they wanted to invest in a law firm. So the rules are pretty clear. There are people who have opinions for and against the concept of listing, and there's no question there are pros and cons associated with being a listed law firm.
Do you think that you were going to see more? I mean, we're obviously seeing private equity quite a lot now in professional services. UK is a good example at the moment, more so than Australia. Do you think the listing model will make a bit of a comeback or not for a while?
Look, in Australia, obviously it suffered a setback with the challenges that Slater & Gordon had, and we've felt that ourselves as a company. So I'd be surprised if there was a lot of movement in the Australian market, at least in the near term. The UK, as you know, Damien, is a more mature model, and there are probably a dozen or more law firms listed in the UK and doing pretty well from all reports. There are other jurisdictions where the world is changing. So the United States closely guarded ownership of law firms only by lawyers via the American Bar Association, but that world is now changing. So there are 2 states in the US that permit alternate business structures, being the state of Arizona and the state of Utah. The model is opening up for ownership by non-lawyers. Whether it becomes systemic around the world is another question, but there's certainly some movement.
One of the things I wanted to touch base with, one of the issues that we confronted as well was, obviously, when you're listed, you've got a scoreboard on your business name, namely the share price. And that may not reflect the fundamentals of the business at times. It may reflect the broader macroeconomic picture. It may be at times, I found in UK, the fact that even though, as you say, it was a more mature market, there were more listed businesses. There's not as much comparatives as other sectors, so you can tell your investors how you're a standout. And as you know, also sentiment matters so much. What do you say to that, Simon? Do you find that can be a bit demotivating at times for people, the sense of morale or the lack thereof about having that scoreboard?
I remember the day we listed Shine, and I came back to the office after the processes we had to go through. And I said to the key leadership team, look, yesterday we were a law firm, today we're a law firm. What's changed is that yesterday all the shareholding was inside Shine, and today some external people have put their faith in us as shareholders. That's the fundamental change. Now, one of the cons with being listed is you are on show. You are on show. As I've often said to people in our business, the share price is nothing more than the market's opinion of the value of your business on a day-to-day basis. And there are so many things that can influence that opinion and not necessarily the underlying financials of the business. So as much as you like to say ignore your share price, it's an obvious thing that markets look at and shareholders look at. So you've got to be cognizant of it, but not let the tail wag the dog.
There's a lot of advantages too in terms of, it seems to me that the partnership model, even in corporatised law, you still have largely the partnership model, is probably here to stay for a bit. But I saw your advantages, as we did too at the time, about sharing some of the, having a corporatised system that you allow people level of ownership and incentives and having everyone having a bit of a stake to row together that a corporatised business can bring you. But at the moment, it still doesn't seem as though...
It's interesting. I participated in a debate at a legal conference in the United States a few years ago, and the topic for the debate was, should law firms be listed, yes or no? And I got the short straw arguing for the affirmative, and I was up against some heavy-hitting American lawyers arguing for the negative. And as I listened to the arguments, the theme that kept coming through was an underlying fear that these spurious hedge funds would come in and scoop up their business and tip them out and everything would be destroyed. And those perceptions were real. I sat and listened to it, and in response, I said, look, there's no question that you have extra challenges when you're facing the market and extra responsibilities, and that's a lot of work. But there are two advantages to the ownership structure in a listed law firm model that you should think about. One is the flexibility of equity. So as you well know, Damien, in a traditional model, it's difficult to move the equity. You've got to have a buy, you've got to have someone to get out, you've got to have agreements as to how that happens. Whereas on a market, that's a very different situation. The other consideration is, unlike in a law firm, when you stop practicing law, that's the end of your income. And the advantage of the listed model is you can build an asset and you can continue to have a dividend stream long after you've left the business. So for all the disadvantages, there are a couple of advantages that are there. The question is, can the model sustainably work to everyone's satisfaction?
It's a good question. And I was on the Yay camp all those years ago, not that long ago, actually. And it was, in my case, an experiment that I'd probably do again, to be frank. There's some salient lessons, and I'll be following the market in Australia, because I think we're going to see first a lot more external investment before we probably see the resurgence again of a listed model. Simon, it's fair to say, we talked about the fact that I finished in 88, you in 86. So 2 years older or thereabouts than me. What keeps you going, and what's next for you personally in terms of what you've achieved, and where's the fire in the belly now?
Well, we're getting older, Damien. I'm 57. I've got a wife and 3 children, eldest daughter 24, so I've sort of been through all that process. Look, what keeps me going is, and I'm grateful that I landed at Shine all those years ago, because what both Kerry Shine and Steve Roach set up was, if you want to do something, we'll back you to have a go. And they've been true to that ever since, and that's what I like doing, is trying new markets, trying new opportunities, and being supported in doing it. I've had a bit of a sort of second wind, I guess, with the international work, and I'm just learning so much. When you're practicing law in one country, you get very focused on what you do in that country, but the learning journey is probably what keeps me going.
What keeps you going. And that's very true. Like, I've been a practitioner in this state for a long time, and you're very much used to the way things are done. So it's great. I enjoyed that aspect of being a part of DW. I liked culturally hearing from other lawyers about what they do differently and better, and having that bigger perspective of, which sometimes as you get more senior in practice, your lens narrows a bit to the way it's done. So it must be fun for you to see that bigger picture, different markets, different approaches, different cultures, etc.
And the more time I spend in different countries, the more I come back to, in civil litigation, the basic formula is the same. The steps are the same. The nuances change with procedures or statutes, and you just got to figure those out. But we're all trying to do the same thing at the end of the day, and it's fun.
Well, Simon, from the Catholic ghettos of Toowoomba to where we are today, thanks so much for joining me, mate. And I think, as I said before, I think we should take stock of the Shine story. It's a great story, and you've been front and centre of it for a long time, and look forward to seeing where the next chapter unfolds, huh? All the very best.
Been a pleasure, Damien. Thanks for having me.